Welcome back, guys, to Mr. Cursed. In today's episode, I'm sharing 8 true, disturbing November camping encounters from the Appalachian Mountains. These stories will make you think twice before pitching a tent in those woods. But before we begin, please consider subscribing, and don't forget to like and share it with your friends. Let me know where you're watching from. Thank you all. Now, let's start. Back when I was 34, I made the worst decision of my life. I decided to go looking for my cousin Danny. I work freelance IT support, which means I fix other people's computer problems, so I don't have to deal with people face to face very often. Danny disappeared in November 1994, when we were both young. He was 20, I was just 14. Him and 4 other college kids went hiking in Jefferson National Forest for a weekend. They never came back. No bodies, no equipment, no trace. My Aunt Sarah spent every anniversary searching those woods until arthritis made it impossible. Last November, when she begged me with tears in her eyes to try one more time, I couldn't say no. See, I figured I had advantages the 1,994 search teams didn't. Modern cameras that could see in near darkness, audio equipment sensitive enough to pick up a mouse scratching inside a tree, electromagnetic sensors that could detect cell phones or GPS devices buried under 30 years of leaves. I studied every police report, every search grid map, every weather pattern from that weekend. I was going to find Danny, or at least find out what happened to him. The campsite was exactly where the files said it would be, a clearing maybe 60 yards from Copper Creek, surrounded by oak trees so old their trunks were wider than my truck. I arrived on a Thursday morning that felt too much like that weekend in '94. Overcast sky, temperature hovering around 42 degrees, air thick with the promise of rain. I spent the first day setting up a perimeter of recording equipment. Cameras pointed inward from different angles, motion sensors, audio recorders, and electromagnetic field detectors. For 24 hours, I recorded normal forest sounds, creek water over stones, branches creaking in the wind, the occasional bird call echoing through bare trees. My equipment captured exactly what you'd expect to find in late autumn Appalachian wilderness. Clean readings, clear video, nothing unusual. Friday night, that changed. I was reviewing the overnight footage when I heard voices in the audio files. Timestamp 2:17 a.m. 3 distinct speakers, 2 male, 1 female, having a conversation about getting the Ace of Base CD back to Kevin before Monday. I played it back 6 times. The voices were clear, close enough that they should have triggered my motion sensors, but my cameras showed an empty clearing. No heat signatures, no movement, nothing. The electromagnetic readings had spiked at the exact moment the voices appeared. Sharp, impossible spikes with no natural explanation. I spent Friday morning running diagnostics, checking every cable and connection. Everything was working perfectly. The voices appeared again at 11:43 a.m., this time discussing Professor Morrison's Monday sociology exam and someone named Brad's new Camaro. 1,990 seconds references, 1,990 seconds slang. My computer analysis confirmed 3 separate vocal patterns, probably college-age speakers, definitely not coming from any location my cameras could detect. Friday afternoon, I heard something that made my coffee cup slip from my fingers. Marcus Williams, is that you? My name, someone calling my name. I ran the voice pattern through analysis software, comparing it to family recordings I'd brought with me. The computer matched it to Danny's voice with 97% certainty. I grabbed the microphone with shaking hands. Danny, where are you? Static. Then, Jesus, Marcus, how are you hearing us? You need to leave. You need to leave right now. My little cousin's voice, exactly as I remembered it, but carrying a weight of terror I'd never heard from anyone. Danny, it's been 30 years. Where have you been? Long pause. 30 years? Marcus, it's been the same 3 days for us. The same weekend, over and over. November 12th to 14th, 1,994. We wake up Saturday morning, set up camp, then Sunday night. His voice broke. Sunday night, something happens to us, and then we wake up Saturday morning again. I checked my electromagnetic sensors. The readings were fluctuating in patterns that looked almost like heartbeats. My cameras were picking up shadows, now human-shaped shadows moving between trees, but no bodies casting them. Danny, how many others? Not just our group, Marcus, there are dozens of us, people from the 1970 seconds, the 1960 seconds, some from way earlier. Every November when the conditions are right, the trap gets stronger. And your equipment? He paused. And I heard other voices in the background, panicked, urgent. Marcus, your equipment is making it worse. You're amplifying whatever keeps us here. That's when I looked at my laptop screen and saw myself. I was watching live video footage of me setting up equipment, except I was watching myself do things I hadn't done yet. The timestamp showed Friday at 3:17 p.m. My watch read 11:43 a.m. I blinked hard and looked at my hands. They were wrinkled, liver-spotted, the hands of a 70-year-old man. I blinked again, and they were normal. Then they were young, smooth, like I was 20 again. Time couldn't decide what to do with me. Danny, what's happening to me? You're getting pulled in. The same thing that happened to us, but slower because you have the equipment acting as an anchor. Marcus, listen to me. There's a storm coming Sunday night. The same storm that trapped us in 1994. If you're still here when it hits, you'll be stuck in the loop with us forever. I tried to pack up. I tried to leave. But every time I carried equipment toward my truck, I'd find myself back in the clearing, setting it up again, with no memory of how I got there. My watch would jump backward, forward, sideways through time. I'd remember conversations that hadn't happened yet, forget things I'd just done. Saturday was when I started to understand the true horror of their situation. I watched Danny and his friends materialize gradually throughout the day. First just voices, then translucent figures, then solid people who looked exactly as they had in 1994. They moved through their routine, like sleepwalkers, setting up tents, starting a campfire, cooking dinner, while their eyes held the terrible awareness of people who had lived the same day 10,000 times. We've tried everything, Danny told me as I watched him unpack a backpack he'd packed countless times before. We've tried hiking out in different directions, staying awake all night, destroying the campsite. Nothing works. Sunday at 11:47 p.m., something takes us, and we wake up Saturday morning, ready to set up camp again. But it was worse than just repetition. I could see the other victims, now a family from 1967, who'd been camping when they disappeared, still wearing their tie-dyed shirts and bell-bottom jeans. A group of hunters from the 1980 seconds in fluorescent orange vests. A young couple from the 1950 seconds. The woman still in a modest hiking dress, the man in wool trousers and suspenders. Dozens of people from across 7 decades, all trapped in their final weekend, all aware of every repetition. The young ones are the worst off, Danny said, nodding toward a Boy Scout troop from 1973. They'd been 12 years old for 50 years. They remember everything, every loop, every failed escape attempt, every time they've watched the sun set on Sunday knowing what comes next. That's when I realized I couldn't just leave them. I spent Saturday night analyzing every piece of data my equipment had collected. There was a mathematical pattern to the electromagnetic anomalies, a specific frequency that seemed to be maintaining the temporal loop. If I could generate a countersignal at the exact moment the storm reached its peak, I might be able to disrupt whatever was holding them. It was dangerous. If I miscalculated, I might strengthen the trap instead of breaking it. But I looked at those children who'd been 12 for 5 decades, at Danny who'd missed 30 years of life, at all those families who'd never gotten to say goodbye, and I knew I had to try. Sunday evening, the storm rolled in, exactly as it had in 1994. Lightning that split the sky with the wrong colors, thunder that echoed for impossibly long, rain that sometimes fell upward before gravity remembered to pull it down. My electromagnetic sensors screamed warnings as reality began to bend. At 11:45 p.m., I activated my signal generator. The world broke apart like glass. I saw every version of that clearing that had ever existed. Trees from different decades overlapping, campsites from different eras occupying the same space, dozens of people from different time periods, all standing together in a place where chronology had no meaning. My equipment shrieked as competing time streams fought for dominance. For a moment that lasted forever, I felt what Danny had felt for 30 years. The horrible awareness that time was a prison, that I was trapped in an eternal loop of the same moments, destined to relive them over and over while the world moved on without me. Then, like a rubber band snapping back, everything went silent. Danny stood in front of me, solid and real, looking exactly as he had at 20, but with eyes that held 3 decades of accumulated horror. Behind him, people from across multiple generations were stumbling around in confusion, looking at smartphones and digital cameras and equipment that hadn't existed when they'd been taken. "Marcus," Danny said, and his voice was different now, weighted with too much experience compressed into too little time. "We're free." The hardest part wasn't explaining to the authorities how dozens of missing persons from across 7 decades had suddenly reappeared. The hardest part was watching Aunt Sarah hold her son, still 20 years old, while she had aged 30 years waiting for him. Danny tries to adjust. But how do you catch up on 30 years of technological advancement when you've been living the same 3 days since 1994? He uses phrases that were outdated before I was born. He flinches when helicopters fly overhead, expecting them to be search and rescue teams looking for his missing group. He wakes up every Saturday morning in a panic, checking his watch to make sure it's not November 12th again. The other survivors have similar problems. The 1,960 seconds family returned to find their relatives dead or in nursing homes. The hunters from the 1,980 seconds came back to a world where their hunting grounds had been turned into shopping malls. The Boy Scouts from 1,973 are trying to figure out how to be 12-year-olds in a world with internet and social media. But there's something else, something I haven't told the researchers or the government officials who debriefed us. I kept copies of all my equipment readings from that weekend. The data shows that my temporal loop-breaking signal didn't just free the people trapped in Jefferson National Forest. It sent a pulse through the electromagnetic spectrum that could have been detected by similar equipment anywhere in the Appalachian mountain range. Which means I might have broken other temporal traps. I might have freed other people who've been missing for decades, all across the mountains. I've dedicated my life to finding out. I've been to 16 locations where large numbers of people have disappeared without explanation. I've found evidence of the same electromagnetic anomalies, the same temporal distortions, the same 3-day weather patterns that create the conditions for time to fold in on itself. But here's what really keeps me awake at night. At 3 locations, my equipment detected the signatures of active temporal loops. But I haven't been able to break them. My signal generator either wasn't powerful enough, or the traps were too well established, or something else is maintaining them. Which means there are people out there, right now, living the worst days of their lives over and over again, aware of every repetition, counting down the hours to their capture, and knowing they'll have to live through it again tomorrow. And I know that if I make one mistake, if I miscalculate one frequency or mistime one signal burst, I could end up joining them. But I can't stop looking. Every time I close my eyes, I see those Boy Scouts who were 12 years old for 50 years. I see families torn apart by time itself. I see Danny's face when he told me about living the same weekend 10,000 times. The mountains are full of temporal traps. They've been collecting people for over a century, maybe longer. And now I'm the only person who knows how to find them and break them. Last week, I got a call from the family of a hiking group that disappeared in the Smoky Mountains in 2003. They want me to investigate. They've heard about what happened in Jefferson National Forest. I told them I'd think about it, but I've already started packing my equipment, because somewhere out there, 21 years after they vanished, 5 college students are living the same weekend over and over again, waiting for someone to set them free. And I'm the only one who knows how. The problem is, every time I use my equipment to break a temporal loop, I risk getting caught in one myself. The electromagnetic fields that create these traps are attracted to the same technology I use to destroy them. I'm walking a tightrope between saving people and joining them in their eternal prisons. But I can't stop, not when I know they're out there, counting the seconds until Sunday night, knowing that no matter how many times they try to escape, they'll wake up Saturday morning and have to live through it all again. Danny tells me I should stop. He tells me I've done enough. But he doesn't understand. I've seen what 30 years of temporal imprisonment does to a person. The way it hollows out their eyes, the way they move through familiar motions while their minds scream with the knowledge that none of it matters. And I know that somewhere in these mountains, there are people who've been trapped even longer than Danny was. I'm going to find them all, even if it kills me, even if I end up joining them, because the alternative is leaving them there forever. And I've learned that forever is a very long time when you're living the same 3 days over and over again. I'm 38 years old and I work as a bank teller down in Asheville. Last November, I took my daughter Amy up to Blue Ridge Mountains for what I thought might be our last camping trip together. She's 15 now, and honestly, our relationship had gotten so bad that I was seriously considering military school for her. The failing grades, the shoplifting, staying out all night without calling. I was at the end of my rope. I figured maybe 3 days in the mountains, just the two of us, might help us remember what we used to be like together. Or at least give me some peace before I had to make the hardest decision of my life. We set up camp at a state park campground, the kind with clean bathrooms and other families around. I was hoping Amy might see some positive examples, maybe remember that not all parents are the enemy. But Friday night went exactly like I expected, her face glued to her phone, texting friends, rolling her eyes every time another family walked by with their kids actually talking to each other. She made these little snorting sounds whenever she saw parents and teenagers hiking together or sharing meals. "Look at those fake-ass families," she'd mutter, loud enough for them to hear. Saturday morning, I was sitting by our fire, trying to figure out how to salvage the weekend when this woman approached from the campsite next to ours. She had this confident smile and perfect camping gear. Everything matching, and obviously expensive. Her daughter was maybe Amy's age, but the difference was night and day. While Amy was still in yesterday's clothes scrolling through Instagram, this girl was helping her mom organize their site, chatting easily about some advanced placement classes she was taking. "I'm Susan Harper," the woman said, extending her hand. "This is my daughter Jessica. We couldn't help but notice you two last night. Mother-daughter trips are so special, aren't they?" I introduced myself and Amy, who barely looked up from her phone. But something weird happened. When Jessica started talking about this robotics competition she'd won, Amy actually put her phone down. She never showed interest in anything educational, but she was listening. Really listening. "Jessica's been student body president 2 years running," Susan continued, somehow knowing exactly which buttons to push. "Varsity soccer, honor roll, volunteers at the animal shelter. We're so close, aren't we, sweetheart?" Jessica nodded, and I felt this stab of jealousy so sharp it took my breath away. Here was everything I'd wanted my relationship with Amy to be. This woman had somehow achieved the perfect mother-daughter bond that seemed impossible for us. "It must be so rewarding," I said, trying not to sound bitter. "How did you manage to keep that connection through the teenage years?" Susan's smile got wider, but there was something in her eyes that made me uneasy. "Oh, Linda," she said, and I realized I'd never told her my name. There are methods, ways to help children reach their full potential. Sometimes they just need the right guidance. The air around us suddenly tasted metallic, like I was sucking on pennies. I glanced around and noticed something strange. There were these little rock cairns set up around their campsite, each one topped with what looked like personal items. A hair scrunchie on one, a class ring on another, a small stuffed animal on a third. When I looked closer, I could see bright red cloth strips tied to the trees behind their tent in these weird geometric patterns that hurt my eyes to follow. "Those are interesting decorations," I said, pointing to the cairns. "Oh, those," Susan said casually, "just little markers, reminders of children who've benefited from spending time with us." Amy was still talking to Jessica, but their conversation had this dreamy quality to it, like they were old friends instead of having just met. And the forest around us had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, no wind in the trees. Just their voices floating in this unnatural quiet. "Would you like Amy to spend some time with Jessica today?" Susan asked. "Sometimes peer influence is more effective than parental guidance. I could show you some of my methods while they're together." Every instinct I had was screaming at me to say no, but Amy surprised me by looking up eagerly. "Can I, Mom? Jessica's telling me about this college prep program. It sounds actually cool." This was the first time in months Amy had shown enthusiasm about anything academic. Despite the weird feeling crawling up my spine, I nodded. Susan pulled out this wooden box from their tent, maybe the size of a shoebox, but carved with symbols I didn't recognize. When she opened it, I caught a glimpse of what looked like children's belongings inside. More jewelry, toys, a retainer, some gaming cards. Each of these represents a child I've helped, she explained, her fingers trailing over the items lovingly. Children who were struggling, like Amy, parents who were at their wits' end, like you. Sometimes a child's true potential is buried under layers of rebellion and poor choices. Sometimes it needs to be extracted. What do you mean, extracted? But Susan was already walking away with Amy and Jessica, and something about the way they moved together made my stomach drop. Their footsteps were perfectly synchronized, and when I looked down, I saw that all three of them left the same handprint in a muddy patch, handprints with only 4 fingers. I spent the day hiking alone, trying to shake off the creepy feeling that had settled in my bones. Around sunset, the girls came back to our campsite. But when Amy walked up to me, everything inside me went cold. "Hi, Mom," she said with this bright, cheerful voice I hadn't heard in years. "Did you have a good day?" "I was just telling Jessica how much I love our camping trips together. We should do this more often." This wasn't Amy. Amy didn't use words like cheerful or talk about loving family time. Amy didn't stand up straight or make eye contact or smile like she genuinely meant it. But here she was, asking about my day, offering to help make dinner, talking excitedly about her college plans. "Amy," I said carefully, "are you feeling okay?" "Of course, Mom. Why wouldn't I be? I was just telling Jessica about how proud I am of my GPA for this semester. And Coach Williams says I have real potential for the soccer team." My daughter had never played soccer. Her GPA was 1.8, and she was moving her hands in this graceful, confident way that belonged to Jessica, not to my clumsy, angry teenager. I looked at her hands as she gestured, and my blood turned to ice. 4 fingers on each hand, just like the tracks in the mud. "Where's Jessica?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who?" Amy, or whoever this was, looked genuinely confused. "Mom, are you feeling all right? You seem stressed. Maybe you should get some rest." I stumbled over to the Harper campsite, but Susan was sitting alone by their fire, reading a book. She looked up with that same knowing smile. "Linda, how was your day with Jessica? I hope you're seeing the improvement already. Where is Jessica? And what did you do to my daughter?" Susan closed her book and gestured for me to sit. The cairns around her site seemed to glow faintly in the firelight, and I could swear I heard whispering coming from that wooden box. "Your daughter is safe," she said calmly. "She's just elsewhere. Along with her anger, her failing grades, her disrespect, all those ugly traits you wanted gone. I've collected them." "Collected them?" "I've been doing this for a very long time, Linda. Longer than you might believe. Parents come to these mountains desperate, at the end of their rope with children who've lost their way. I help them. I take the bad and leave the good." The box beside her was humming now, a low vibration I could feel in my teeth. She opened it again, and this time I could see it was much deeper than it should have been, filled with layers upon layers of children's belongings stretching down into impossible darkness. "Each item represents a trade," she continued, "a difficult child exchanged for a perfect one. The parents are always so grateful. They get the daughter or son they always dreamed of, and I get to feed on what I remove. The anger, the rebellion, the wasted potential, it sustains me." I was backing away slowly, but Susan's shape was changing in the firelight. Her arms were stretching longer, her skin taking on a pale, translucent quality. She wasn't human, hadn't been human for a very long time. "You can't have her," I whispered. "But I already do, and you have what you wanted. A respectful, successful daughter who loves you. Isn't that worth preserving?" I could hear Amy, the new Amy, calling for me from our campsite, asking if I wanted help with the s'mores, this perfect version of my child who would never cause me worry or heartbreak. But it wasn't her. It was some hollow replica wearing her face. "I want my real daughter back. Your real daughter was failing. Your real daughter was breaking your heart. This one will make you proud." The thing that had been Susan unfolded to its full height, easily 8 feet tall, with arms that hung past its knees. Its face was still recognizable, but stretched thin over a skull that was the wrong shape entirely. "The trade is permanent, Linda. It has to be, for the magic to work. But if you're truly determined to make a mistake," it gestured to the box, and I could hear voices coming from inside. children's voices, calling for their parents. And underneath them all, I heard Amy's voice, my real Amy's voice, scared and small, and asking for me. I grabbed the box before the creature could stop me. It was heavier than it looked, and warm like living flesh. The moment my hands touched it, I could feel everything inside. Decades of children's stolen traits, their fear, their confusion. And Amy's essence, so familiar and precious, even wrapped in all her teenage anger and disappointment. "Give her back," I demanded. The creature lunged for me, but I was already running, clutching the box to my chest. Behind me, I could hear the fake Amy screaming, not like my daughter, but like something inhuman whose disguise was slipping. I made it to our campfire and threw the box into the flames. The creature appeared beside me instantly, trying to pull it out, but its hands hissed and burned when they touched the fire. The box caught immediately, burning with colors that shouldn't exist, and the screaming that came from inside it nearly broke my heart. But then I heard Amy, my real Amy, calling my name. Not the polite, cheerful version, but angry and scared and completely herself. "Mom, Mom, what the hell is happening? Where am I?" The fake Amy collapsed like a deflated balloon, and my real daughter materialized beside the fire, stumbling and disoriented but wonderfully, perfectly flawed. The creature was dissolving too, its pale flesh crumbling like old paper. "You don't understand," it whispered as it fell apart. "She'll break your heart again. She'll disappoint you. I was giving you peace." "She's mine," I said, pulling Amy close. The real her. All of her. When the box finished burning, there was nothing left of Susan or her campsite. No cairns, no red ribbons, no evidence they'd ever existed. Just me and Amy, holding each other in the firelight, both of us crying. The drive home was quiet, but a different kind of quiet than before. Amy didn't apologize for everything that had happened before the trip, and I didn't pretend the creature's offer hadn't been tempting. But something had changed. Maybe it was seeing how much I'd fought for her, or maybe it was experiencing firsthand what it felt like to have your essence stolen. But she was different. Not perfect, not transformed, just present in a way she hadn't been in months. We still have problems. She's still failing math, and we still fight about her curfew. But I never think about military school anymore. When I look at her, my real daughter, with her messy room and sarcastic comments and genuine laugh, I remember what that creature would have taken from me. Not just the bad parts, but everything that makes her Amy. I researched missing children in that area when we got home. Found dozens of cases over the decades, kids who vanished from campgrounds with their families, never found. But also found reports of children who came home, changed. Perfect students who'd been struggling before. Respectful kids who'd been rebellious. Parents who insisted their children were so much better after camping trips, even when neighbors whispered that something was different about the kids. I never told anyone what really happened up there. But sometimes late at night, when Amy's staying out past curfew and I'm worried sick, I catch myself remembering that box full of stolen perfection. And I have to remind myself that loving someone means loving all of them, even the parts that break your heart. I'm 22 years old and I work delivering pizzas around the Morgantown area. Back in November, I was dealing with the kind of heartbreak that makes you do stupid things. My girlfriend Sarah had just left me for some pre-med student she met at WVU, and I was spiraling pretty hard. Couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, kept checking her Instagram like some kind of masochist. My roommate finally told me I needed to get away from everything for a few days, so I loaded up my beat-up Honda with camping gear and drove up into the Monongahela National Forest. I found a spot way off the beaten path, maybe 6 miles from the nearest marked trail. Had to park at an old logging road and hike in with all my gear. The place was perfect for what I had planned, which was basically drinking myself into oblivion while feeling sorry for myself. No cell towers, no other campers, just thick West Virginia wilderness and a small creek that gurgled over limestone rocks. I set up my tent in a clearing surrounded by old-growth oak and maple trees, their bare November branches creating a canopy that blocked out most of the sky. Friday night went exactly like I expected. I built a small fire, cracked open the first of a 12-pack of Yuengling, and started sending angry drunk texts to Sarah that wouldn't go through anyway. No signal out there, which was exactly what I wanted. By the time my phone died around 11, I was properly hammered and feeling like maybe this trip was actually helping me process things. I stumbled into my tent and passed out in my clothes. What woke me up wasn't a sound so much as a feeling. You know that sensation when you're home alone at night and you suddenly know someone else is in the house with you? It was like that, but amplified. My mouth tasted like stale beer and regret, and my head was pounding from dehydration. I fumbled for my phone to check the time, remembered it was dead, and lay there in my sleeping bag listening to the absolute silence. That's when I realized how quiet it really was. No wind, no insects, no night birds. Even the creek seemed to have gone silent. The only sound was my own breathing, which seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. Then I heard it. Heavy footsteps moving in a wide circle around my campsite. But the rhythm was all wrong. The steps came too far apart, like whatever was making them had legs that were way too long for a human. And there was something else, a wet, sliding sound between each footfall, like something being dragged through the fallen leaves. The pattern was deliberate, methodical, 30 seconds of movement, then a pause. Another 30 seconds, another pause. Like something was studying my campsite, taking measurements. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to that thing circle my tent. My mouth was dry as sandpaper, but not from the hangover anymore. My heart was beating so hard, I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. The air inside my tent felt thick and wrong, like trying to breathe through wet cotton. Every breath tasted metallic, like I was sucking on pennies. When dawn finally broke, the circling stopped. I waited another hour before I worked up the courage to unzip my tent and look outside. What I saw in the mud around my campsite made my stomach drop through the ground. Handprints. Dozens of them, pressed deep into the soft earth around my tent. But they weren't human hands. These things were massive, easily twice the size of my own, with 6 fingers each and the thumbs in the wrong places. Worse than that, the palms were facing backward, like whatever had made them had arms that twisted the wrong way at the shoulder. Each print glistened with a thick, oily residue that smelled like copper pennies mixed with something organic and rotten. The trees around my campsite looked like they'd been attacked by something with claws. Long strips of bark had been peeled away in perfect spirals, starting about 10 feet up and going all the way to the ground. The exposed wood underneath was still weeping fresh sap that had a reddish tint to it. Some of the lower branches had been snapped clean off and arranged in neat piles at the base of each tree. But the thing that really messed with my head was what I found near my fire pit. 3 cairns, perfectly balanced stacks of flat river stones, each about 3 feet tall. And sitting on top of each one was something from inside my tent. My flashlight, my wallet, my car keys. I knew for a fact those items had been zipped inside my tent with me all night. I also knew for a fact that the zippers were still closed when I woke up. The air still tasted wrong, metallic and sharp, like the moment before lightning strikes. But underneath that was something else. Something organic and cloying that made my throat close up. It smelled like meat that had been left out in the sun too long, mixed with the copper penny taste that was coating my tongue. I packed up my gear as fast as my shaking hands would let me and started hiking back toward the logging road. That's when I realized my nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. Something was following me through the woods, something big enough to snap tree branches 20 feet off the ground, something with a stride so long it could step over fallen logs that came up to my chest. I never saw it directly at first, but I could hear it moving parallel to my path, staying just inside the tree line where the underbrush was thickest. The sounds it made weren't quite right either. Instead of normal footsteps, there was this wet, sliding noise, like something being dragged across wet concrete. And between each step, I heard a sound that turned my blood to ice. A soft clicking, like someone rapidly typing on a keyboard, but organic. Like finger bones tapping against tree bark. Every time I stopped to catch my breath, it stopped too. When I sped up, it matched my pace exactly. When I tried to change direction, it adjusted its course to stay parallel with me. Whatever was following me wasn't just tracking me, it was herding me. About 2 miles from my car, I came around a bend in the trail and stopped dead. My camping gear was laid out in the middle of the path. The exact same gear I'd just spent 20 minutes packing into my backpack. My sleeping bag, my camp stove, my water bottles, even my dirty clothes from the night before. But they weren't just dumped there randomly. They were arranged in a perfect geometric pattern, like a mandala made from my personal belongings. The worst part was that when I checked my backpack, everything was still there too. Somehow, whatever was following me had created perfect duplicates of all my gear. Not copies. These were identical, down to the specific stains on my sleeping bag, the dent in my water bottle, even the exact way my socks were balled up. I was staring at this impossible arrangement when I heard the clicking sound again, much closer this time. I looked up and saw it stepping out of the tree line about 50 yards ahead of me. I've tried to describe what I saw to other people, but words don't do it justice. Imagine someone took a human being and stretched it like taffy. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in those massive six-fingered hands. Its head was tilted at an angle that would have snapped a normal neck, and its skin was the color of old meat, gray-white with dark veins visible underneath. But it was the proportions that really got to me. Everything was just slightly wrong, like someone had built a person from memory and gotten the measurements off. Its eyes were the worst part. They were too intelligent, too knowing. This thing was studying me the way a scientist studies a lab rat, and I got the distinct impression it had been doing so for a very long time. It raised one of those impossible arms and pointed at me with a finger that had too many joints. Then, it started to move. The way it walked was hypnotic and horrifying at the same time. Each step was perfectly placed, deliberate, but the timing was all wrong. It moved like someone learning to walk by watching videos played at the wrong speed. When it tried to mimic my posture, raising its arm when I raised mine, tilting its head when I tilted mine, the movements were just off enough to be deeply unsettling. When it opened its mouth and tried to speak, what came out made my skin crawl. It sounded like human words played backwards through water, syllables stretched and twisted until they were almost recognizable but completely wrong. I caught fragments that might have been English. Ith, us, eep. But the voice had too many tones, like multiple people speaking in unison but slightly out of sync. The clicking sound was coming from its fingers. It was tapping out complex rhythms against its own legs, like it was taking notes or sending signals. Every few seconds, it would pause and cock its head, listening for something I couldn't hear. That's when I realized what it was doing. It was studying me, learning my patterns, my responses, my behaviors, the way it tilted its head when I moved, the way it tried to copy my gestures but couldn't quite get them right, the clicking rhythms that seemed to correspond to my heartbeat. This thing was cataloging me. I don't remember making the decision to run. One second I was standing there in paralyzing terror, the next I was crashing through the underbrush like a wounded deer. Branches whipped at my face, thorns tore at my clothes, and my lungs burned with each desperate breath. Behind me, I could hear it following, but not chasing. The sound suggested it was still moving in those same measured, deliberate steps, like it knew exactly where I was going and wasn't worried about keeping up. The really terrifying part was that it seemed to be circling me as I ran, moving through the woods in those same wide arcs it had made around my campsite. Every time I thought I'd gotten away, I'd hear that wet sliding sound off to my left, or the clicking of bone against bark somewhere to my right. It was hurting me again, keeping me moving in a specific direction. When I finally burst out of the tree line and saw my car sitting on the old logging road, I nearly cried with relief. But when I tried to start the engine, nothing happened. The dashboard lights flickered weakly, my phone was completely dead, and my GPS showed nothing but static. Even my analog watch had stopped, the hands frozen at 3:33. I popped the hood and immediately saw the problem. Something had been at my engine. The battery cables had been removed and rearranged in that same geometric pattern I'd seen with my camping gear. Not cut, carefully disconnected, and laid out in precise spirals around the engine block. But here's the thing that really made my blood run cold. The cables were warm to the touch, and they had that same oily residue on them as the handprints back at my campsite. It took me 20 minutes of fumbling with shaking hands to reconnect everything, and the whole time I could feel eyes watching me from the tree line. I never saw it again directly, but I knew it was there, studying me, learning how I solved problems under stress. When the engine finally turned over, I drove out of those mountains like the devil himself was chasing me. I didn't stop until I was back in Morgantown with streetlights and cell towers and other people around me. That was 8 months ago. And I still can't explain what happened to me up there. My phone and GPS never worked properly again. The electronics were somehow corrupted at a fundamental level. I had to replace everything. But the weirdest part is this mark on my shoulder blade, right where my shirt collar doesn't quite cover it. It looks like a handprint, but with 6 fingers. The skin is pale white against my normal complexion, and it's warm to the touch. Always exactly 1 degree warmer than the rest of my body. Doctors say it's probably just a weird birthmark they never noticed before, but I know better. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can feel those 6 fingers pressing against my skin, like something is still taking measurements. I don't camp anymore. I don't even like being alone after dark. People think I'm paranoid now, but they didn't see what I saw. They didn't feel those eyes studying them, cataloging them, learning them. The worst part is that I know it's still up there, somewhere in those mountains, and I know it's not alone. Those geometric patterns, those precise measurements, that methodical study of human behavior, that's not the work of some mindless creature. That's science. That's research. And I think I was just one subject in a much larger experiment. Last week, I saw a missing person flyer at the grocery store. College student named Marcus Chen disappeared while hiking in the Monongahela forest. The photo showed him standing next to a trail marker, smiling at the camera, but in the background, just barely visible at the edge of the frame, was a tree with bark peeled away in perfect spirals. I threw the flyer away, but I couldn't throw away what I saw. They're still out there, still studying us, still learning, and I think they're almost done with their research. I'm 29 years old and work as a cashier at the Food Lion in Harrisonburg. I guess most people would say I'm just getting by, you know? Single mom, 2 kids, trying to figure out how to make everything work after my husband died in a car accident about 8 months ago. The boys, Alex and Ben, they're twins, just turned 7. They'd been asking me all summer about going camping. Their dad used to take them fishing sometimes, but we'd never done the whole tent thing as a family. Looking back now, I should have picked somewhere closer to home for our first trip. But the Shenandoah Valley campground looked perfect on their website. Family-friendly, other kids around, bathhouses with hot showers. I figured if we were going to do this, we might as well do it right. The boys had been through enough already. We got there on a Friday afternoon in early November. Perfect weather, honestly. Cool but not cold. Leaves still hanging on the trees in these amazing reds and golds. Alex and Ben were bouncing around the campsite like pinballs, so excited they could barely help me set up the tent. There were maybe 6 other families there, kids running around between the sites, parents sitting by their fires with coffee cups. It felt normal, safe. Like maybe we could actually do this whole single-parent thing. That first evening went exactly like you'd hope. The boys made friends with some kids from the site next to us. The Hendersons, I think their name was. Nice couple with a daughter about the same age. We roasted marshmallows, told stories. The kids played flashlight tag until way past their bedtime. When we finally crawled into the tent, both boys were giggling and whispering about how this was the best adventure ever. Saturday morning started perfect too. The boys woke up at dawn, of course, ready to explore. After breakfast, I sent them off to play while I organized our gear and chatted with some of the other parents. The campground had this big open area where kids could run around, plus trails leading into the woods. Safe enough that you didn't have to hover, but close enough to keep an eye on things. Around lunchtime, Alex came running back to our site, Ben trailing behind him with his arms full of something white. "Mom, look what we found." Alex was practically vibrating with excitement. "There's a whole pile of building sticks back in the woods." That's when I got my first look at what they were carrying. Clean white sticks, all different sizes, some curved, some straight. Too clean, honestly, too perfectly shaped. When I picked one up to examine it closer, I realized what I was holding. "Boys, these aren't sticks," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "These are bones." They looked at me like I was crazy. "No way, Mom," Ben said. "Bones are yellow and gross. These are white and smooth." He held up what I now realized was definitely some kind of leg bone, probably from a deer. "See? And look how they fit together." He wasn't wrong about that part. The bones seemed designed to connect with each other, like some kind of natural building set. When Alex arranged a few pieces on the picnic table, they locked together in these perfect geometric patterns. Triangles, spirals, interlocking shapes that hurt to look at too long. "Where exactly did you find these?" I asked. "Just past the trail marker," Alex said, already arranging more pieces. There's this cleared spot where someone left a whole bunch of them in neat piles, like they were saving them for us. I should have thrown them away right then. Should have marched the boys back to that clearing and made them put every single bone back where they found it. But they were so happy, so excited about their discovery. And honestly, what harm could clean animal bones do? Kids play with sticks and rocks all the time. By afternoon, half the kids in the campground were involved in what they started calling bone building. The Henderson girl, plus 2 boys from another site, all working together to create these increasingly complex structures around our picnic table. The bones really did fit together in impossible ways, forming towers and archways and spiraling patterns that seemed to follow some kind of mathematical logic I couldn't quite grasp. That's when I noticed the silence. You know how the woods are usually full of sound? Birds calling, insects buzzing, squirrels chattering, leaves rustling. But whenever the kids were working with the bones, everything went completely quiet. Dead quiet, like someone had hit a mute button on the entire forest. "Hey," I called to one of the other parents. "Do you notice anything weird about how quiet it gets when they're playing with those things?" She looked around, listening. "Now that you mention it, yeah, maybe the noise scares the animals. But kids making noise in the woods doesn't usually silence everything. Animals might move away, but you still hear distant sounds, wind in the trees, something." This was different. This was like the forest was holding its breath. That night, after the kids had finally gone to bed and the other parents had retreated to their tents, I couldn't sleep. Something felt off about the whole campsite. I kept hearing footsteps outside our tent, slow and deliberate, walking in what sounded like perfect circles around the perimeter. When I finally worked up the courage to unzip the flap and look out, I saw them. Stone cairns. Little stacks of rocks, maybe 2 feet high, placed at regular intervals around the entire campground. They definitely hadn't been there when we arrived. On top of each stack was something small and white. In the moonlight, I couldn't quite tell what they were. I grabbed my flashlight and crept out to the nearest cairn. When the beam hit it, my stomach dropped. Human teeth. A handful of them, arranged in a small pile on top of the rocks, some with roots still attached, like they'd been pulled out recently. All perfectly clean and white. I checked 3 more cairns. Same thing, teeth on every single one. When I got back to our tent, I noticed something else. Bright red fabric strips, tied to tree branches, in a perfect circle around our campsite. I was sure they hadn't been there earlier. The material looked new, like someone had just cut it from fresh cloth. I barely slept that night. Every sound made me jump. Around 3 a.m., I heard what sounded like the boys calling my name from somewhere in the woods. But when I checked the tent, they were both sound asleep. The voices kept calling, "Mom, Mom," but the voices were wrong somehow. Right words, right tone, but the timing was off. Too much pause between syllables. Like someone was trying to mimic my kids' voices, but couldn't quite get the rhythm right. Sunday morning, I was ready to pack up and leave. But when I mentioned it to the boys, they went ballistic. They weren't finished with their bone projects. They had to complete the pattern. It was important. That was the first time I really looked at their skin. Both boys had developed this pale, waxy texture overnight, especially on their hands and faces. When I touched Alex's arm, his skin felt cold and slightly damp. "Are you feeling okay, honey?" I asked. "We feel fine, Mom," they said in perfect unison. That's when I realized they'd been speaking in unison a lot over the past day, answering questions together, moving in sync when they worked with the bones. I'd thought it was just twin behavior, but now it seemed wrong. I decided we were leaving after lunch, whether they liked it or not, but when I started packing our gear, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Handprints in the mud around our picnic table. But these weren't normal handprints. They only had 4 fingers, and the palm was facing the wrong direction, like whoever made them had their hands on backwards. And the symbols, carved into tree bark all around our site. Spirals and triangles, fresh cuts that were still bleeding sap. They looked almost like the patterns the kids had been building with the bones, but more complex, more deliberate. That afternoon, while I was trying to convince the boys to help me pack, I saw it. Something tall and pale standing at the edge of the tree line, maybe 50 yards away. At first glance, it looked human, but the proportions were all wrong. too tall, maybe 8 feet. Arms that hung down past where its knees should be. And it was perfectly still, just watching the kids work with their bone structures. When I blinked and looked again, it was gone. But then I heard it. Footsteps too heavy for something that looked so thin, walking in those same perfect circles around the campground. And now I could see the pattern. It was marking territory, claiming the space, claiming the children. The boys had cuts all over their hands from the sharp edges of the bones, but they didn't seem to notice or care. They just kept building, kept adding pieces to structures that were getting taller and more complex by the hour. Other kids had joined them, all moving with that same synchronized precision, all with that same pale, waxy skin. That's when I realized what was happening. This thing, whatever it was, had been here for a long time. Maybe centuries. It was patient, it studied children, learned how they moved and spoke and thought, and it was teaching them something with those bone patterns, preparing them for something. When I tried to physically pull the boys away from their construction, they fought me with strength that didn't seem possible for 7-year-old kids. Their joints moved at slightly wrong angles, like their bones had been subtly rearranged. "We have to finish the pattern, Mom," Alex said, his voice flat and mechanical. "It's very important that we finish the pattern." The other parents were starting to notice something was off too. Kids who had been laughing and playing 2 days ago were now silent, focused, working together on bone structures that were getting more elaborate and frankly impossible looking by the hour. That's when I made my decision. If we were going to get out of there, it had to be right now. And I was going to have to do something drastic. I grabbed the camp shovel and started smashing the bone structures. The reaction was immediate and violent. All the kids screamed at once, the same piercing sound, and rushed at me. The pale figure at the tree line came rushing toward the campsite with that jerky, unnatural movement, like a marionette being controlled by someone who wasn't quite sure how human bodies were supposed to work. I kept swinging the shovel, breaking apart the intricate patterns the kids had spent 2 days building. With every structure I destroyed, I could hear something screaming from deep in the woods. Not human, not animal, something old and angry and desperate. When I smashed the last major construction, something incredible happened. The bones burst into flames. Bright white fire that didn't burn my hands but seemed to burn something else. And in those flames, I saw shapes. Child-shaped shadows, dozens of them, rising up out of the burning bones and disappearing into the sky. The pale figure let out a shriek that I felt in my bones, then turned and ran back into the woods with that horrible puppet-like gait. As soon as it was gone, my boys collapsed. When they woke up a few minutes later, they didn't remember anything about the bone structures. They were just confused about why I was crying and why there were ashes all over the picnic table. We packed up and left that afternoon. I threw all our camping gear away when we got home. Couldn't stand to look at it. The boys are fine now, mostly. But they won't touch chicken bones when I cook dinner, won't walk past the skeleton display at the Natural History Museum. And sometimes, when they're playing together, they move in perfect synchronization for just a few seconds before catching themselves and breaking apart. I called the campground a week later to report what we'd found. Told them someone was leaving animal bones around for kids to find. They said they'd investigate, but when I called back, they claimed they'd never heard from me. To this day, I still have dreams about those bone patterns, complex geometric shapes that seem to mean something important, something I'm supposed to understand. But every time I wake up, I make myself forget them as fast as I can. I don't take the boys camping anymore. I was 19 when this happened, back in November of 1987. I'd been working as a mechanic at my uncle's shop in Beckley, West Virginia, saving up money and trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. My girlfriend Carol and I had been together since high school, and I'd been carrying around my grandmother's engagement ring for about 2 months, waiting for the right moment to ask her to marry me. I figured a romantic camping trip to my grandfather's old spot up in the mountains would be perfect, somewhere special, away from everyone else, just the two of us. My family had been working these mountains for 3 generations. My grandfather used to take me up to this particular hollow when I was a kid, teaching me how to fish and hunt, but more importantly, teaching me the old rules. He'd always told me there were certain places you didn't go, certain sounds you didn't follow, and certain times when you packed up and left without asking questions. "Bobby," he'd say, These mountains are older than anything you can imagine, and some things up here don't take kindly to visitors. I thought it was just old mountain superstition back then. The spot we chose was about 15 miles up an old logging road, near some abandoned mining operations from the 1942nd. It had always felt safe to me. My grandfather brought me there dozens of times, and we never had any problems. There was a small clearing next to a creek, perfect for a tent, and enough flat ground to build a decent fire. I'd borrowed my dad's truck and loaded it up with everything we'd need for the weekend. Sleeping bags, food, a cooler full of beer, and a little battery-powered radio that could pick up stations from Charleston if the weather was clear. Carol was 18 and worked at the diner downtown. She'd grown up in the suburbs and had never done much camping, but she was excited about the adventure. I remember she packed way too many clothes and kept asking if we'd really be safe up there with no phone or anything. This was before cell phones, obviously, and the nearest house was probably 10 miles down the mountain, but I felt confident. I knew these woods, knew my grandfather's spot, and I had everything planned out perfectly. We drove up Friday afternoon, and everything went exactly like I'd hoped. The weather was crisp but not too cold, the leaves were still showing their fall colors, and Carol was amazed by how quiet and beautiful everything was. We set up camp before dark, and I followed all my grandfather's old traditions without really thinking about it. Iron nails in the tent corners, a thin line of salt around our campsite, and a small offering of tobacco left on a tree stump. Carol laughed at me for being superstitious, but I told her it was just family tradition. That night, I proposed by the fire after we'd finished dinner. She said yes, and we spent hours talking about our future, making plans, feeling like we had the whole world figured out. The ring fit perfectly, and she kept holding her hand up to the firelight to watch it sparkle. We could hear owls calling back and forth across the hollow, and the creek was running just loud enough to be peaceful. It was honestly the most perfect night of my life. I woke up Saturday morning feeling incredible. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and Carol was still asleep next to me with a smile on her face. I climbed out of the tent to get the fire going again and make some coffee, and that's when I noticed the first thing that was wrong. There were stone cairns around our campsite that hadn't been there the night before. 6 of them, each about 3 feet tall, perfectly arranged in a circle, maybe 50 yards from our tent. Every single one was topped with an animal skull. Deer, raccoon, what looked like a large bird. The stones were stacked too perfectly, too deliberately, and I knew for certain they hadn't been there when we went to sleep. I walked over to examine one of them more closely, trying to figure out what kind of animal would arrange stones like that, when I noticed the handprints. They were pressed into the soft mud around the base of each cairn, but something was wrong with them. They only had 4 fingers, and the palms were facing the wrong direction, like whatever made them had been standing behind the stone pile but reaching forward. Carol woke up while I was standing there staring at the prints, and when she saw the cairns, she just froze. "Those weren't there last night," she said quietly. I told her I knew, that maybe it was just kids from town playing pranks. But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. We were too far from anywhere for kids to hike up here, and besides, some of those skulls looked old, weathered, like they'd been sitting in the sun for years. As the morning went on, more things started appearing. Bright red strips of cloth, tied to tree branches in perfect geometric patterns extending from our campsite into the woods. The cloth looked new, like it had just been put up, but it was everywhere. Dozens of trees marked with red fabric as far as we could see into the forest. The pattern was too regular, too mathematical to be random. And then there was the taste in the air. Every time the wind blew from deeper in the hollow, we'd get this metallic flavor in our mouths, like copper pennies or rust. Carol started complaining that she couldn't get the taste out, even after drinking water and brushing her teeth. It was strongest near the cairns. Around noon, we found fresh symbols carved into the trees around our campsite. Spirals cut deep into the bark, still bleeding sap, arranged in clusters of 3. They definitely hadn't been there Friday night, and the sap was so fresh it was still sticky. Whatever had made them was strong enough to cut through bark with something sharp, and precise enough to make the spirals perfectly round. That's when Carol started acting strange. She kept staring off toward the deeper part of the hollow, like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. Her skin had gotten pale and waxy looking, and she was moving differently, with little jerky motions like a marionette. When I asked her what was wrong, she'd snap back to normal for a few minutes, but then drift off again, always looking in the same direction. I suggested we pack up and leave, but every time I started putting gear away, I'd lose track of time. Hours would pass like minutes, and I'd find myself standing in different parts of the campsite with no memory of walking there. The red cloth patterns seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at them, and staring at them too long made my head feel fuzzy. By late afternoon, I could see something watching us from the tree line. It was tall and pale, standing perfectly still about 100 yards away, holding what looked like a long staff or walking stick. When I pointed it out to Carol, she said she couldn't see anything, but she started walking toward the spot where it was standing. I had to grab her arm to stop her. That's when I heard it calling our names. But it was using our own voices, my voice calling Carol, her voice calling me. Except the timing was wrong. The tone was off, like someone had recorded us and was playing it back badly. Carol responded to it like it was really me calling her, and I had to physically hold her back from walking into the woods. As the sun started setting, I remembered more of my grandfather's warnings. He'd told me about something he called the shepherd of the wrong flock, something that had been in these mountains since before people settled here. He said it collected humans like livestock, keeping them in hidden hollows for reasons nobody understood. And he'd warned me about the signs: bone cairns, red markers, symbols carved in trees, voices calling from the woods. The entity stepped out of the tree line just as full dark hit. It was impossibly tall, maybe 8 or 9 feet, with arms that reached nearly to the ground and joints that bent in directions that hurt to look at. Its skin was the color of old bone, and it was carrying a shepherd's crook made from what looked like human bones twisted together. But the worst part was its eyes, ancient, intelligent, patient. Like it had been doing this for centuries. Carol started walking toward it again, and this time I couldn't stop her. She moved like she was sleepwalking, with that same jerky motion, and when I grabbed her, her skin felt cold and rubbery. The thing in the woods made a sound like wind through hollow reeds, and I could feel it in my chest, some kind of subsonic frequency that made my bones vibrate. I remembered the iron nails my grandfather had taught me to carry, and I pulled one out of my pocket. The moment my skin touched the cold metal, my head cleared and Carol stopped walking. The entity tilted its head and took a step back. Iron, my grandfather's old protections, actually worked. I grabbed the tire iron from the truck and started scraping away the salt line I'd made around our campsite, breaking the circle while holding the iron nail. The moment the circle was broken, the entity's hold on Carol snapped completely. She collapsed, gasping, and for the first time in hours, her eyes looked normal. The shepherd thing let out a sound like breaking glass and started moving toward us, but slowly, like it was testing the boundaries of something. I could see other figures moving in the woods behind it, dozens of them, all with that same pale skin and jerky movements. People it had collected over the years, I realized. Its flock. I threw everything we had into the truck as fast as I could, half carrying Carol because she was still weak and disoriented. The entity and its followers stayed at the edge of the clearing, watching us but not approaching. As we drove away, I could see them in the rearview mirror, standing perfectly still like fence posts, until the headlights swept around a curve and they disappeared. We didn't stop driving until we hit the interstate, and we didn't talk about what happened for almost a week. Carol's engagement ring had turned black during our encounter, and her finger had a white mark under it that didn't fade for months. She still gets that faraway look sometimes, especially when we drive through mountains, and I have to say her name twice to get her attention. I never went back to that hollow, and I made sure to tell my younger cousins about the real family warnings my grandfather had tried to teach me. There are things in these mountains older than the Cherokee, older than any human settlement, and some of them don't distinguish between wild animals and people when they're building their collections. Looking back now, I realize how close we came to joining whatever that thing was keeping in the deep woods. Sometimes I wonder about all the missing persons reports from these mountains over the years. People who vanished without a trace while hiking or camping. I think I know where some of them ended up. Carol and I got married 6 months later, but we honeymooned at Virginia Beach instead of anywhere near the mountains. To this day, neither of us can stand the sight of red cloth tied to trees, and we both carry iron nails in our pockets when we travel, just in case. I'm 22 years old and work as a night manager at a McDonald's in Asheville. Not exactly the career path I had in mind, but after Rachel dumped me and took half my stuff, I needed something steady to pay rent. This was back in November, about 3 weeks after she moved out and left me with nothing but an empty apartment and a truck payment I couldn't really afford. I'd been feeling pretty sorry for myself, drinking too much beer, and sending angry texts that I'd delete before hitting send. My buddy Marcus kept telling me I needed to get out, clear my head, do something other than sit around feeling miserable. So when I got a Friday off, I threw some camping gear in my truck and decided to head up to Pisgah National Forest. Figured I'd find a quiet spot, drink a few beers, and maybe figure out how to stop feeling like such a failure. The drive up was nice enough. Late November in the mountains is pretty much perfect. Cold enough that the bugs are gone, but not so cold you can't enjoy a campfire. I'd been camping in Pisgah since I was a kid, usually with my dad or friends, but this time I wanted to be completely alone. No other campers, no trail runners, nobody to pretend I was doing okay around. I found this spot about 2 miles off the main trail, down near a little creek that probably didn't even have a name. Perfect for what I needed. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and cracked open my first beer before the sun even went down. The plan was simple. Drink until I felt better, sleep it off, and drive home Sunday with a clearer head. For a while, everything went exactly like I hoped. The fire was nice, the beer was cold, and I only thought about Rachel every few minutes instead of constantly. I even managed to eat some of the sandwiches I'd packed, instead of just living off whatever was left in my truck's console. By around 10 o'clock, I was feeling pretty good about my decision to come up here. I remember texting Marcus around 11, telling him the camping trip was exactly what I needed. Then I put my phone away, finished my third beer, and banked the fire for the night. The woods were quiet in that peaceful way they get sometimes, just the creek babbling and maybe an owl somewhere off in the distance. I crawled into my tent feeling more relaxed than I had in weeks. I woke up around midnight to something moving around outside my tent. Big something, from the sound of it. My first thought was bear, which isn't uncommon up there, especially this time of year when they're trying to put on weight before winter. I lay still and listened, figuring it would sniff around and move on if I didn't give it a reason to be interested. But whatever was out there, it wasn't acting like any bear I'd ever heard about. It was moving too deliberately, too quietly for something that size. I could hear branches breaking, but not in the random way a bear would make noise. This sounded almost careful, like whatever was out there was trying not to wake me up but wasn't quite sure how. I stayed in my sleeping bag for maybe an hour, listening to it move around my campsite. Sometimes it sounded like it was right next to my tent, sometimes it seemed to be over by the creek. But it never went away completely, and it never made the kind of noise you'd expect from a normal animal. No grunting, no heavy breathing, no sounds of it eating or drinking or doing anything that made sense. Eventually the noises stopped, and I must have fallen back asleep because the next thing I knew, it was getting light outside, and I could hear birds starting up in the trees around my campsite. When I crawled out of my tent that morning, I knew immediately that something was wrong. There were claw marks on the trees around my camp, deep gouges in the bark that went up maybe 8 feet high. But these weren't like any claw marks I'd ever seen. They were too big, for one thing. Each individual scratch was maybe 6 inches long, and they were grouped in sets of 4, like fingers. I walked around my campsite looking at the damage, trying to make sense of it. Whatever made these marks was huge, bigger than any black bear, maybe even bigger than a grizzly, and we don't have grizzlies in North Carolina. The scratches were still bleeding sap, which meant they'd been made recently. Like, during the night while I was sleeping recently. But the worst part was this depression in the ground about 20 feet from my tent. It looked like something had been sitting there for a long time, just watching. The grass was flattened in a rough circle, maybe 4 feet across, and there were what looked like handprints pressed into the soft dirt around the edges. Not paw prints, handprints, with what looked like long fingers ending in those same claws that had torn up the trees. I should have packed up right then and gotten out of there. I know that now, and I knew it then too. But I was 22 and stupid and still thinking like everything in the world had a logical explanation. So I convinced myself it was probably just a really big bear. Maybe one that was sick or injured and acting weird because of that. I decided to hike back toward the main trail. Maybe find a ranger or another camper who could tell me if they'd seen signs of problem bears in the area. I left my camp set up, figuring I'd come back and get my stuff once I knew what I was dealing with. The hike back should have taken maybe an hour, but I'd only been walking for 20 minutes when I started to feel like I wasn't alone. Nothing dramatic, just that feeling you get sometimes when you think someone's watching you. I kept looking over my shoulder, but the woods looked normal. Trees, undergrowth, rocks, nothing that shouldn't be there. But then I started noticing this shadow keeping pace with me off to my left. At first I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe the way the morning light was filtering through the trees. But every time I stopped, the shadow stopped too. When I started walking again, it started moving again. I got maybe 50 yards from the main trail when I found the deer. Something, had killed a doe and arranged it across the path like a roadblock. Not just killed it, but positioned it very deliberately, with its head pointing back toward my campsite and its legs stretched out to block as much of the trail as possible. The whole thing looked ritualistic, like a warning or a message. The deer was fresh, maybe killed that morning. There wasn't much blood, but there were those same claw marks across its ribs, 4 parallel slashes that went deep enough to show bone. Whatever had done this was strong enough to kill a full-grown deer quickly and quietly, then carry or drag it to exactly the right spot to block my path. I stood there staring at that deer for maybe 5 minutes, trying to process what I was looking at. The shadow to my left had stopped moving when I stopped, and I was starting to get the feeling that it was watching me, waiting to see what I would do. That's when I smelled it for the first time. This thick, musky smell, like wet fur and old meat, and something else I couldn't identify. It was strong enough to make my eyes water, and it seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. I turned around and started walking back toward my campsite, moving fast but trying not to run. The shadow kept pace with me, and that smell followed me the whole way back. By the time I got to my camp, my hands were shaking and I was having trouble catching my breath. I sat down by the cold ashes of my fire and tried to think. I was probably 2 miles from the nearest road, 3 miles from the parking area where I'd left my truck. No cell service, no other campers around, nobody who even knew where I was except Marcus, and I hadn't told him exactly where I was going. And something big and smart and territorial was watching me. I was trying to decide whether to pack up and leave when it stepped into the clearing. I saw it for maybe 10 seconds before it melted back into the trees. But that was long enough. It was standing about 50 yards away, next to a big oak tree that I knew was at least 6 feet around. The thing was taller than the tree was wide. It looked like someone had tried to build a person but gotten all the proportions wrong. Too tall, too broad across the shoulders, arms that hung down almost to its knees. It was covered in dark, matted fur, but its face was more human than animal. Ancient eyes that looked right at me with what I can only describe as scientific curiosity. It didn't act aggressive. It just stood there, studying me like I was some kind of interesting bug it had found. Then it raised one enormous hand and moved it side to side, like it was waving. When I didn't respond, it tilted its head and tried again. I don't know how long we looked at each other. Probably only a few seconds, but it felt like forever. Then it stepped backward into the trees and vanished so completely that I started to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. But I could still smell it, and I could hear it moving around in the woods around my campsite, not hiding anymore, just circling, keeping me in sight while it decided what to do with me. I sat by my cold fire pit as the sun went down, listening to it move through the trees. Sometimes I could see hints of shadow between the trunks. Sometimes I could hear branches breaking under its weight. But it never came closer than maybe 30 yards, and it never acted like it wanted to hurt me. It was studying me, learning my patterns, my scent, my reactions, testing me somehow. When it got full dark, I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut, knowing how useless that thin nylon would be if the thing decided it wanted in. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening to footsteps circling my campsite. Big, careful footsteps that stopped every few minutes like it was listening for something. Around 2 a.m, it came right up to my tent. I could hear it breathing outside the fabric, maybe 2 feet from my head. Deep, slow breaths like it was trying to memorize my smell. Then I felt pressure against the tent wall, a massive hand pressing against the nylon, fingers spread wide. The hand stayed there for maybe 30 seconds, and I could feel the warmth of it through the fabric. Then I heard the sound of my tent's zipper being slowly, carefully pulled down about 6 inches. It knew what a zipper was. It understood tools, I held my breath and didn't move, and after a few minutes that felt like hours, I heard it step back from the tent. The footsteps moved away toward the creek, and I didn't hear anything else until the sun started coming up. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, the clearing was empty. But there were fresh tracks in the dirt around my tent, massive footprints that looked almost human, except for the size and those long claw marks at the end of each toe. I packed up my gear in maybe 15 minutes and got out of there. Didn't stop running until I reached my truck. Didn't stop driving until I was back in Asheville. I never went back to that part of the forest. Hell, I barely go camping at all anymore, and when I do, it's at established campgrounds with lots of other people around. I told Marcus I had a good time and left it at that. What was I going to say? That something the size of a grizzly bear had spent 2 nights studying me like a science experiment and then decided to let me live? But sometimes, when I'm having trouble sleeping, I think about those intelligent eyes and wonder what it was really doing out there. Whether it was just curious about humans, or whether it was deciding something. And I wonder if it's still there, watching other campers, making those same calculations. I still work at McDonald's, still live in the same apartment, still don't talk to Rachel, but I don't feel sorry for myself as much anymore. Hard to worry about normal human problems when you've looked something genuinely wild in the eye and realized how small you really are in the grand scheme of things. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that it let me go on purpose. That it could have killed me any time it wanted to, but chose not to, for reasons I'll never understand. And honestly, I'm not sure I want to understand them. I'm Bobby McDaniel, and I'm 56 years old now. I work down at Patterson's Auto Shop here in Beckley, West Virginia, same place I've been for going on 30 years. Most folks around here know me as the guy who can fix just about anything with an engine, but there's something else about me that not many people know. Something that happened back in November of '87, when I was just 19 and thought I knew these mountains better than anybody. See, my family's been working these West Virginia hills for 4 generations. My granddad used to run equipment for the mining companies back in the day, and he taught me every hollow, every old logging road, every place where it was safe to camp, and every place you'd better steer clear of. I grew up thinking I had the mountains all figured out. That was my first mistake. The whole thing started because I wanted to do something special for Carol. She was my girlfriend at the time, 18, worked at the diner in town, prettiest girl I'd ever seen. We'd been together about 8 months, and I had something important I needed to ask her. Had my grandmother's engagement ring in my pocket and everything. I figured a romantic weekend camping trip would be the perfect time to propose. Carol had never been much for the outdoors, but she trusted me. I told her I knew exactly where to take her, a little spot my granddad had shown me years back, up near an old mining road that most people had forgotten about. It was beautiful up there, with a clear creek running through and plenty of flat ground for a tent. Granddad always said it was one of the safe places, where the old families used to camp during hunting season. I remember loading up my old Chevy pickup that Friday afternoon. We had everything we needed: tent, sleeping bags, camp stove, even brought a bottle of wine I'd been saving. Carol packed sandwiches and her famous chocolate chip cookies. The whole drive up, she was laughing and singing along to the radio, excited about our little adventure. I felt like the luckiest guy in the world. The camping spot was exactly like I remembered it. Creek was running clear and cold, just like Granddad always said to look for. There were game trails everywhere, birds singing in the trees, even saw a few deer drinking at the water's edge when we first pulled up. All the signs that told you this was a good place, a place where things lived and thrived. Granddad had taught me to read those signs when I was barely old enough to walk. I set up our tent while Carol arranged our supplies. Just like Granddad had shown me, I left a small offering of tobacco by the creek, old mountain tradition he'd passed down. Always show respect to the mountain, he used to say. It'll take care of you if you take care of it. Everything felt right that evening, perfect, even. We cooked dinner over the campfire, drank that wine, and watched the stars come out. And that's when I did it. Got down on one knee right there by the firelight and asked Carol to marry me. When she said yes, I thought my heart might burst clean out of my chest. We stayed up late talking about our future, making plans, feeling like nothing in the world could touch us. But when we woke up Saturday morning, something had changed. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet you get in the mountains. This was different. This was complete, absolute silence. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, not even the sound of wind in the trees. Even the creek seemed to be running quieter than it should have been. Carol noticed it too. "Bobby," she said, sitting up in her sleeping bag, "where are all the birds?" I stuck my head out of the tent and looked around. She was right. Yesterday evening, this place had been alive with sound. Now it felt empty. Dead, almost. But I didn't want to worry her, especially not after such a perfect night. "Probably just too early," I said, though I knew that wasn't right. It was past 8 in the morning. The birds should have been raising all kinds of noise by then. As the day went on, it got worse. We didn't see a single animal, no birds, no squirrels, no deer, nothing. It was like every living thing had just up and left during the night. Carol kept asking me about it, and I kept making excuses. But honestly, it was starting to get to me too. Around noon, Carol said she wanted to leave. "Something doesn't feel right here, Bobby. I don't like it." But I was stubborn. Granddad had always said this was a safe place, and I'd camped here before without any problems. I convinced her to stay one more night. Looking back now, that was the biggest mistake I ever made. By afternoon, the air itself started feeling wrong. Thick and heavy, like right before a big storm, except there wasn't a cloud in the sky. We both started having trouble breathing, like we were up at high altitude, but we were only about 1,500 feet above sea level. Carol kept saying she felt tired, even though we'd barely done anything all day. That's when I found the first cairn. I was gathering firewood when I came across it, a stack of stones about 3 feet high, arranged in a spiral pattern. It was maybe 50 yards from our campsite, hidden behind a clump of rhododendron bushes. The stones looked old, weathered, like they'd been there for years. But the thing was, I knew this area. I'd been here before. There hadn't been any stone piles the last time I'd camped here. I started looking around more carefully, and I found 2 more, then 4 more. They were arranged in a rough circle around our campsite, maybe 100 yards out. Each one was built the same way, stones stacked in that spiral pattern, old and weathered. I remembered something then, something Granddad had told me years ago about certain patterns of stones, about markers that meant you were somewhere you shouldn't be. He'd called them warning signs, put there by people who knew the mountains better than anybody. People who knew about things that lived in the deep places. The Old Hungry, he'd called it once, when I was maybe 10 or 11. Something that's been in these mountains since before there were people here. Something that feeds on more than just meat and blood. I'd thought it was just a story back then. Mountain folklore, the kind of thing old-timers liked to tell to scare kids. But standing there looking at those cairns, I started remembering more of what Granddad had said. About hollows that looked safe, but weren't. About places where the Old Hungry waited for people foolish enough to camp where the animals wouldn't go. When I got back to our campsite, Carol was sitting by the cold fire pit, looking pale and shaky. She'd aged. I swear to God, she'd aged. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there that morning, and I could see gray streaks in her hair. "Bobby," she said, and her voice sounded older too, tired and strained. "I keep forgetting things. I keep trying to remember why we came here, but I can't hold on to the thought." That's when I realized I was having the same problem. The proposal, the ring, the happiness we'd felt just the night before. It all seemed distant and hard to grasp, like trying to remember a dream after you wake up. Something was feeding on us. On our joy, our youth, our life itself. I could feel it now, a presence in the woods around us, old and patient and hungry. It had been watching us since we'd arrived, probably since we'd crossed into its territory. I ran to the truck, but it wouldn't start. The engine turned over, but it wouldn't catch. The radio was dead too, just static on every station. Even my flashlight was getting dimmer, like the batteries were draining. That's when I saw it. It came out of the tree line just as the sun was setting, and it was nothing like I'd expected. It wasn't some monster or ghost or demon. It was just wrong. Shaped like a person, but too tall, too thin, moving in a way that made my eyes hurt to look at. Its skin was the color of old bark, and when it moved, it made no sound at all. It stood there at the edge of our campsite, studying us. I could feel its attention like a physical weight, pressing down on us, making it hard to think. Carol had gone completely gray now, and when she tried to stand up, her legs almost gave out. I remembered something else Granddad had taught me then. About iron and salt, about old protections that worked against old things. I grabbed my tire iron from the truck and the road salt I kept for winter driving. Drew a circle around Carol with the salt, just like Granddad had shown me. The thing didn't like that. It tilted its head too far, further than any human neck should bend, and made a sound like wind through dead leaves. I cut my hand on the tire iron's edge and let my blood drip onto the metal. More of Granddad's teachings, though I'd never thought I'd have to use them. Iron blessed with your own blood that was supposed to be able to hurt things that came from the deep places. When the old hungry came for us, I was ready. The fight didn't last long. The thing was fast, faster than anything had a right to be, but when I hit it with that blessed iron, it actually staggered back, made a sound like screaming wind. Carol, even weak as she was, managed to complete the salt circle while I kept it busy. It couldn't cross the salt. Old laws, Granddad had said. Old agreements between the mountain and the people who knew how to respect it. The thing circled us for what felt like hours, looking for a way in, but the protections held. Just before dawn, it gave up, melted back into the shadows like it had never been there at all. Carol started getting her color back almost immediately, the gray fading from her hair, the lines disappearing from her face. By the time the sun was fully up, she looked like herself again. We packed up and got out of there as fast as we could. The truck started on the first try, like nothing had ever been wrong with it. We drove straight to Granddad's house, and I told him everything that had happened. He just nodded, like he'd been expecting it. "I was wondering when you'd run into the old hungry," he said. "Been waiting for you in that particular hollow for a while now. Some places call to it, places that used to see a lot of joy in life. It gets hungry for what it used to have." Carol and I got married 6 months later. Granddad performed the ceremony himself, included some old mountain blessings in the service. Protections that would keep our family safe from things like the old hungry. We've got 3 kids now, all grown up with kids of their own. I never went back to that hollow, and I never will. But I did learn the rest of Granddad's teachings, all the old mountain knowledge that's been in our family for generations. Somebody has to keep it alive, to pass it on. Somebody has to know which places are safe and which places aren't. Because the mountains are beautiful, and they'll take care of you if you know how to respect them. But there are still things in the deep places, old things that remember what it was like before people came. And if you're not careful, if you don't know the signs, they'll take more from you than you ever thought you had to give. To this day, I still keep road salt in my truck, just in case. I'm 29 years old, and I work the register at a Food Lion in Harrisonburg. My husband Carlos died in a car accident last winter, and honestly, I'd been struggling to keep it together for my twin boys ever since. Alex and Ben are 7, and they'd been acting out at school, getting into fights, not sleeping well. The grief counselor said maybe a change of scenery would help, so when the insurance money finally came through, I decided to take them camping for the first time in their lives. I found this family campground online called Pine Ridge, tucked away in the Shenandoah Valley. It looked safe enough. Other families around, clean bathrooms, a little camp store. The boys had never slept in a tent before, and for the first time in months, I saw them get excited about something. We loaded up my old Honda with sleeping bags and s'more supplies, and on that Friday evening in November, we drove into the mountains. The campground was exactly what I'd hoped for. Peaceful, quiet. Other families were setting up around us, kids running around with flashlights. Alex and Ben forgot all about missing their dad for a while, chattering about roasting marshmallows and sleeping under the stars. We got our tent pitched just as the sun was going down, and for the first time since Carlos died, I felt like maybe we were going to be okay. Saturday morning, the boys were up before dawn, begging me to let them explore while I made coffee on the camp stove. The campground felt different in daylight, older somehow, with these massive oak trees that must have been growing there for decades. I told them they could play around our site, but to stay where I could see them. That's when Alex found the journal. He came running over with this old leather book in his hands, dirt still clinging to the cover. "Mom, look what I found buried under the picnic table." Ben was right behind him, eyes wide with excitement. The journal was weathered and brown, the leather cracked with age. When I opened it, I found page after page of children's drawings and stories, all signed with different names and dated from the 1960 seconds and 70 seconds. There were crayon pictures of campfires and cabins, stories written in careful cursive about hiking and swimming and camp games I'd never heard of. The boys were fascinated, flipping through every page, pointing at the drawings, and asking what this game was or what that building used to be. I figured some kid had lost it years ago, and it had just been buried under leaves and dirt ever since. Looking back now, I should have thrown that thing away right then. But the boys loved it, and after months of seeing them so sad, I couldn't bring myself to take away something that made them smile. They spent the whole morning copying the drawings, trying to figure out the games described in faded pencil. When I asked the camp store owner about it, she told me the campground had been built over an old children's summer camp that closed back in the late 70 seconds. Some kind of accident, she said, but wouldn't elaborate. Her face went pale when I mentioned the journal, and she excused herself to go help another customer. By Saturday afternoon, I started noticing changes in my boys. Alex, who's always been the quiet one, started talking with this slight southern accent that came out of nowhere. When I asked him about it, he just shrugged and said that's how people talked at camp. Ben, meanwhile, kept claiming he remembered things from the stories in the journal, like they were his own memories. "Remember when we went fishing at the old dock, Mom?" he'd say, pointing to a drawing of a wooden pier. "And Tommy caught that big bass?" I'd remind him we'd never been fishing at any dock, that we'd only arrived yesterday. But he'd just look at me confused, like I was the one misremembering. It got worse as the day went on. They started forgetting Spanish words I'd taught them since they were babies, claiming they'd never learned Spanish at all. Alex, who used to follow Ben everywhere, suddenly became the leader, ordering his brother around in ways that didn't feel like him. Ben, who's normally outgoing and confident, became timid, always looking to Alex for permission before speaking. That evening, while I was trying to get a fire started, Ben asked me why our car didn't have a proper steering wheel. When I showed him the steering wheel, he touched it like he'd never seen one before and said it looked all wrong. The strangest thing was when Alex started calling me Miss Patricia. Not Mom, Miss Patricia. When I corrected him, he'd look at me like I was confused and say, "But that's your name, isn't it? You've always been Miss Patricia." I tried to take the journal away that night, thinking maybe it was just making them too imaginative. But they both fought me for it, with a strength that didn't seem natural. Alex actually drew blood scratching my arm, and when I looked into his eyes, I didn't see my son. I saw someone older, angrier, desperate. That's when I decided to do some research. I sat in the camp store that night, using their Wi-Fi on my phone, digging through old newspaper archives. What I found made my blood turn cold. The children's camp that used to be here had burned down in July 1978. 12 children had died in a dining hall fire when the building's exits became blocked by fallen timber during a summer storm. The article mentioned that the fire had started during an evening campfire program that got out of control. The bodies of 2 children, Tommy Patterson, age 8, and William Billy Chen, age 7, were never recovered from the ruins. When I got back to our tent, the boys had drawn detailed maps of the campground showing buildings that weren't there anymore, a dining hall, a craft cabin, a dock extending into what was now just empty woods. Every detail matched the old photographs I'd found online, down to the placement of picnic tables and the exact curve of pathways. Alex looked up at me with eyes that seemed decades older than 7 and said, "Miss Patricia, when are Mama and Papa coming to pick me up? I've been at summer camp for such a long time. The other kids got to go home after the fire, but Billy and me, we're still here." Ben nodded, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Tommy says we have to wait. Tommy says we have to finish what we started that night." They weren't responding to their real names anymore. When I called for Alex and Ben, they'd just stare at me blankly. But if I said Tommy or Billy, they'd come running with an eagerness that broke my heart. Sunday morning, I woke up to find them building what they called the perfect campfire. They'd gathered deadwood, paper, anything that would burn, piling it higher than their heads. When I asked them what they were doing, Alex, or Tommy, I couldn't tell anymore, looked at me with a smile that was all wrong on my little boy's face. "We're going to have the best campfire tonight, Miss Patricia. Just like the night we all went to sleep forever. And this time, we're going to make sure everyone gets to stay together." I looked around the campground and noticed something that made my stomach drop. The other families that had been here all weekend, they were gone. All of them. Their campsites empty, as if they'd packed up and left in the middle of the night. We were completely alone. That's when I understood what was happening. Those children who died in the fire, their memories, their personalities, their desperate need to complete what had been interrupted, it was all trapped in that journal. And my boys weren't just becoming vessels for the dead, they were being prepared as kindling for a fire that had been waiting 45 years to finish burning. I had to make a choice that no mother should ever have to make. I grabbed a handful of the camping fuel we'd brought for our portable stove and doused the journal before either boy could stop me. But the moment I struck the match, Alex lunged at me with inhuman speed, his small hands wrapping around my throat with a grip stronger than any 7-year-old should possess. "You can't," he screamed in a voice that cracked between my sons and something older, more desperate. "We've been waiting so long, we just want to go home." Ben joined him, clawing at my arms, trying to knock the burning match from my hand. But I held on, even as my own children tried to kill me, and dropped the flame onto the journal. The book erupted in flames that burned blue and white, hotter than any normal fire. Both boys collapsed instantly, convulsing as if something was being torn out of them. And rising from the burning pages, I saw them, wisps of light, but not peaceful ones. They twisted and writhed like smoke, and in their movement, I could see the outlines of children, their faces twisted with rage and disappointment. 12 lights rose from that fire, but only 10 drifted away into the morning sky. Tommy and Billy, whatever was left of them, they circled back. They dove into my boys' still bodies like water finding a crack. Alex and Ben's eyes snapped open, but they weren't the same. They'd never be the same. The possession was permanent now. Not complete. My sons were still there, trapped inside their own minds with 2 dead children who would never leave. I could see it in their eyes when they looked at me. Fear, confusion, a silent plea for help I couldn't give. Alex speaks with Tommy's voice now more often than his own. Ben calls me Miss Patricia at least half the time. They remember things from 1978 as clearly as they remember yesterday. Sometimes they'll ask when their other parents are coming to pick them up. Sometimes they wake up screaming about smoke and falling timbers. The doctors say it's trauma from losing their father. They prescribe therapy and medication. I let them. What else can I do? Tell them my children are sharing their bodies with dead kids from a summer campfire? We moved away from Harrisonburg. I couldn't stay there, knowing what I'd brought back with me. The boys go to school, do their homework, play with other kids. But sometimes I catch them drawing maps of buildings that don't exist, or speaking in whispers about camp activities that happened before they were born. The worst part is the gratitude I see in Tommy and Billy's eyes when they look at me. They're thankful. Thankful to be alive again, even like this. Thankful for borrowed time and borrowed bodies. They're polite, helpful, eager to please their new Miss Patricia. And my real sons? They're prisoners in their own minds, sharing space with ghosts who just wanted to go home. I keep the camping gear in my closet, but will never use it again. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I made the right choice. If maybe it would have been better to let the fire finish what it started 45 years ago. But then I look at my boys, what's left of them, and I know I couldn't let them burn, even if saving them meant losing them forever. That's the thing about being a mother. You'll choose a living hell over losing your children completely, even when that hell is exactly what you've created. The journal may be gone, but Pine Ridge is still there, still taking families. I've seen the missing persons reports from that area. Always families with children, always during camping season, always in November, when the veil between the living and the dead grows thin. And sometimes, when Alex looks at me with Tommy's eyes, he smiles and says, "Miss Patricia, we made some new friends at camp. They're still waiting for their parents to pick them up." I know I should warn people. I should tell them to stay away from Pine Ridge. But who would believe me? And honestly, some nights when my boys are crying in their sleep, speaking in voices that aren't their own about fires and falling timber and going home, I think maybe those other families are the lucky ones. At least their hell ended quickly.